that Barb read. I mean, can't you just relate? I can relate to him. You know, have you ever finished watching the evening news? If you watch evening news or you saw it on the internet, and there was all this violence. I mean, I think of the violence in Charlottesville, the injustice, and you may have asked, whether out loud or in your mind or even in your prayers, where is God? Why isn't God doing something about this? Why do the wicked and the dishonest people prosper? Why do they get elected to the White House? Okay, that's probably not fair. No, actually it is. But I mean, if God is in control, why does evil often win? And what is God going to do about North Korea? Right? How can God ignore injustice? How can a good God use evil to accomplish his purposes? Now, if those questions are scrambling around in your brain, you should be able to identify with Habakkuk. Or is it Habakkuk? I'm going to say Habakkuk. I know Joy has a different way of pronouncing it, but I started that way, I can't stand it. So as those questions rattle in your brain, take out the quiz, because I don't want you to forget the quiz, and take a couple minutes, go through that and see if you can answer the questions, and then we'll get going. Habakkuk grappled with God about questions that I think are still relevant today. Now that brings us to their very first question. Habakkuk's name means A, wrestle, B, friend, C, slayer, and D, doubter. How many say wrestle? Ooh, a couple. Oh, and you didn't even cheat. Well, just so you know, Lori's right. It means wrestle or embrace. And as usually the case, his name has something to do with the message of this book. I think it relates to the fact that he wrestled with all those age-old questions that we were just asking. The book is based right around 610 BCE, after the fall of Nineveh, which happened in 614. As we talked about 2 weeks ago, and it was prophesied by, this isn't on the test, but I just thought if anybody remembered what we talked about 2 weeks ago. Okay, go ahead and cheat and look and see. What did we talk about 2 weeks ago?
Yeah,
Nahum. Remember, Nahum actually prophesied that Nineveh was going to be destroyed, and it was. Of course, I had Hosea on there, but you're right. It was Nahum. Habakkuk is the last of the minor prophets before Jerusalem fell to the Babylonian forces in 597 BC. And he prophesies between two kings of Judah. The first king was the good king Josiah, who actually died in 609, and then the bad king, Jehoiakim, his successor. If you read the text in Habakkuk, he tells us nothing really of his personal life. We don't really know very much about him. But if you think about it, he's kind of like the doubting Thomas of the Old Testament. Because it seems he always has a question for God. And I think that's one of the reasons I probably like him so much, because I think that's an important part of our faith. Also, because it's a really short book. We probably read half of it. Lynn or Barb probably read, whoever you are, read half of almost half, which brings us to the second question. How many verses?
26.
No. But that's nice guess. Any other ideas? It's actually three chapters and 56 verses long. We could have read the whole thing just now, and you would have been done with it, but it's very, very short. But it's also a very unusual book. It's the only prophetic book, and now we're in number 3. And let's find out if we know. It's the only prophetic book that, never mentions God. Anybody want to go over that one? No? Begins by Habakkuk addressing God directly. Anybody figure that? You know, that's true. I mean, if you were looking at what was read, it's right there. Yeah, he starts out by saying, hey, God, what's going on? I don't get this. He's the only book that begins by addressing God directly. All the other books, God uses the prophets to share his message to the people, but in Habakkuk, we have a back and forth between Habakkuk and God. Habakkuk even dares to question the plans of the Lord to use the Babylonians to administer justice and judgment on Judah, where he is, admitting that he has more than a little concern or confusion over God's plans. I mean, listen to chapter 1, verse 13, one that we didn't read. He says, oh God, your eyes are too pure to behold evil, and you can't look on wrongdoing. Why do you look on the treacherous and are silent when the wicked swallow those more righteous than they? That's a good question. We could ask those questions today, can't we? But sin was rampant in Judah, and that brings us to number 4. And I'll just tell you, they worshipped idols. They sacrificed their children to pagan gods. They ignored God. So the answer to number 4 is they didn't enslave the poor. But the wicked king Jehoiakim refused to let God's prophets preach. He burned their writings. He arrested several of them and ended up murdering one. And Habakkuk sees this and sees the official remedies of law and justice aren't working. Verse 4, we read, and the law is powerless. Justice never goes forth. For the wicked surround the righteous, therefore perverse judgment proceeds. I think we can think of a number of modern parallels to this situation. We can think of back in the 60s, just prior to the civil rights movement, where Southern courts failed in many situations to provide justice for African Americans who were being lynched and killed. And guilty whites were able to escape punishment as the law turned a blind eye to their hate. That even continues to today, doesn't it? As we've read in the headlines over the past couple of years, where unarmed blacks are killed, often because of hate. Then there's the LGBTQ folks, who have long been discriminated and deemed second-class citizens, especially, unfortunately, in the church. Well, ancient Judah was just as corrupt. And so Habakkuk questions God, how long, O Lord, will I call for help, and you will not hear? Well, Habakkuk isn't the only one who's questioned God. Some people think that men and women of faith never question God. They just sit and wait patiently and faithfully. But one thing we can learn from Habakkuk is that that's a misconception. Those who trust in God can and do question God. The scriptures are filled with men and women who share our confusion in the midst of events and announcements. Job, for example, faithful man, blessed immeasurably by God, was rocked to his core when his family and his fortunes were destroyed. The Old Testament records Job's and his friends' attempts to make sense of this tragedy as they engage in debates and questions. And then there's Joshua, asked to attack a small city armed with nothing but power-walking crowd of immigrants with trumpets. Abraham was encouraged to try to have a baby with a 90-year-old wife. Or Joseph, who was sold into slavery by his brothers and subsequently was put into prison for a crime he never committed. No doubt each of these men and their families were lost in that moment of confusion and wondered where God was, or why they were subjected to the injustice of their situations. Which brings us to 5. I already mentioned the first 3, so the answer is D, Judah, which is actually a tribe of Israel. Oh my goodness, that's who we're talking about. After each of Habakkuk's questions comes God's reply. The back and forth structure of this book between God and Habakkuk is a wonderful picture of God engaging one-on-one. Habakkuk protests the contradictions he sees. Habakkuk thought he could rely on God to oppose the wicked and champion the cause of the needy. But God seems to be doing nothing at all. And when he promises to intervene in the text, we find it's not very good news. You see, the unexpected, unbelievable, unpredictable something that God is about to do is not to usher in a great blessing to Habakkuk and his people, but to exact terrible judgment on his people through the neighboring superpower, and here we are at number 6, Babylon. How do we trust a God who can take a bad situation and make it 1,000 times worse? Well, as Habakkuk found out, it's only through faith. Old Testament scholar Walter Brueggemann describes 3 stages in the life of our faith. Usually our faith begins with a focus on security, counting on God to provide for us emotionally, physically, spiritually. We naturally want to trust God in his overarching control, but this kind of trust begins to feel impossible as we face disappointments in life. Disappointments that can disrupt our faith as our life sometimes seemingly lies in ruins. We get hit with unpleasant surprises. Maybe a spouse serves divorce papers. A company makes unexpected job cuts. A doctor makes the prognosis of cancer. We pray for recovery and it never comes. A child brings home a fiancé who's surely going to doom their future together. Or we see others' dilemmas and we feel powerless. Or even our nation. Such predicaments seldom make us feel like, well, we can just let go and let God. Instead, we're hit with confusion, aren't we? Why, God, are you letting this happen? We cry out. And our faith becomes painfully disoriented. Many of us spend most of our lives in the first phase. Securely oriented in our faith, we feel we have no need to dig too deep into what we believe or why. But when that catastrophic event comes along, the resulting painful disorientation of our faith may seem irrevocably broken. But disruptive events that God allows to happen don't always have to debilitate faith. Sometimes they can deepen it. And that brings us to the third phase. This surprising reorientation can result in a stronger, deeper faith. You see, building a strong and reliable faith does not mean that we have to avoid the challenges of life, but rather finding a way to see through them to something greater on the other side. There are 3 clues in the story of Habakkuk that help us develop a faith that we are able to face up to rather than shy away from the uncertainty that God sends into our lives. The first clue relates to the future. See, God's first response to Habakkuk's complaint is to tell him to, hey, wait and watch. Now, waiting is difficult for us, especially in our culture of immediacy. But God exhorts Habakkuk to play the long game. Things may seem unpalatable in the short term, but God promises that one day there will be a reckoning. One day things will work out. And God calls each of us to patient endurance, to trust that this apparent unpredictability will ultimately be proven to be utterly consistent, even if that's not realized until we pass over to the other side. Our second clue comes from the past. Habakkuk remembers in the 3rd chapter, and we read, and there we are in number 7. He reads, and we're going to be. He recounts the rescue of his people from the Egyptian tyranny. He remembers the details of the Egyptian soldiers, their horses and arrows and chariots, defeated in the waters of the Red Sea. You see, looking to history helps Habakkuk remember God's compassion, his power, his impeccable character and timing. But you know, it's not just remembering our personal experiences of God's blessing that helps. Truth is, the more conversant we are with the Old and New Testaments and those stories of faith, the less historically myopic we become, the better equipped to be faithful in unpredictable times. And then finally, the 3rd clue involves the present. Sometimes our faith or life seems like a zero-sum game with winners and losers. Habakkuk definitely felt like he was on the losing team. The Babylonians looked like they were going to be on a winning streak. You see, if our love for God is dependent upon being on the apparent winning team, we're destined to be disappointed. Habakkuk knew that true faith was about living in the ups and downs of the present, knowing that God is still in control, whichever way things go. And if you read his final prayer, which is chapter 3 in his book, the last prayer, the last chapter, it models a type of faith which runs absolutely counter to the consumer mentality that infects many of us. You see, at one of the darkest points in Israel's history, with disaster looming, Habakkuk composes a song of praise and unshakable faith. Whatever surprises and shocks God may have in store, Habakkuk turns to his faith. See, when justice lags, we have the feeling that justice will never come, but God promises that it will. It's faith in God which makes us believe that there is light at the end of the tunnel. And it's that light at the end of the tunnel that helps us to make it through. It's the pregnant lady's knowledge that the pregnancy will finally end that helps her endure. It's the soldier's hope of escape or rescue that helps them endure as prisoners of war. You see, even as Habakkuk heard that God would use the Babylonians to punish the people of Judah, the bigger point was God's statement about how to handle life in the meantime. In chapter 2, verse 4, it says, "Behold the proud. His soul is not upright in him." And now we're at number 8. The seminal verse in the book of Habakkuk is, A, "Be still and know that I am God." Now that's a good verse, but it's not in Habakkuk. "Love God, and he will watch thy path." Great verse. Not in Habakkuk. "Humble yourself in the sight of the Lord." Another great verse. But it's not in Habakkuk. The verse that we need to hold on to today, "The just shall live by faith." The just shall live by faith. That quote's very important in the New Testament. It's no less than 3. This is the answer to number 9. 3 New Testament letters mention this passage. It's mentioned in Romans, the letter to the Galatians. It's mentioned in Hebrews. Here, Habakkuk finds a way out of his confusion. While he had hoped for an explanation from God regarding the methods God chose or the timing God would use instead, God provides a path of action. Habakkuk doesn't have to understand or like God's plan, doesn't even need to question it, but it's okay that he does. He just has to trust God and live by faith. Habakkuk reminds us that it's perfectly fine to suffer and be confused. We don't need to pretend that everything's fine and put on a mask of tranquility when we're in turmoil. But while we search for answers, we need to remember that our God is bigger than our questions and problems. We need to trust that God is ultimately good, even when we can't comprehend His plans. Now, we're not asking for blind faith, simply putting more trust in the truth of God than the pain of our own experience. So this last chapter of Habakkuk provides the perfect prayer. The one prayer that always seems to be answered. It's part of the prayer that Jesus taught. It's when He prayed in the Garden of Gethsemane. The perfect prayer that's always answered is, "Thy will be done." Jesus shaped His entire life according to God's will. Habakkuk, after complaining about unanswered prayer, eventually did the same. He came around in chapter 3. "O Lord, I have heard of your renown. I stand in awe of your work. In your own time, revive your will. In our own time, make your will known." And then he concludes with this that Barb read just a few minutes ago. "Though the fig tree doesn't blossom, there's no fruit on the vines, the produce of our olives fails, and the fields yield no food. Though the flock is cut off, there's no herd in the stalls. Yet, no matter how bad things get, no matter how low I may feel, I will still rejoice in the Lord, and I will exult in the God of my salvation." Habakkuk is saying, in effect, "God, thy will be done." He promised that even if things got bad, the crops dried up, the herds destroyed, he would still trust God. And in that final verse, he writes, "God the Lord is my strength. He makes my feet like the feet of a deer, an animal that treads safely and high in dangerous places." And Habakkuk prays that God's deed, not his own deeds or desires, might be renewed. Truth is, best prayers draw us closer to God. The best prayers line us up to God's will, not ours. And that's where Habakkuk eventually gets to in his prayers. He starts by complaining, but as he prayed, his attitude changed. And that's the invitation this morning, I think, from that book to all of us. That we might trust God, be patient, and know that His will is always better than our own. May we pray, "Thy will be done," and know that a better future is always in store. Amen.